from a high level, we'll talk about MDaemon's features, what it has to offer, and then we'll get a little bit more technical as we progress. Of course, it's a mail server that's available in 9 languages. There's a webmail component that is available in 26 languages. That's our MDaemon Webmail. That also includes Dropbox and Google Drive integration. Mobile device management using ActiveSync policies, remote wipe, and things like that, which we'll talk about. MDaemon includes email encryption using OpenPGP encryption. There's a simple message ticketing system we have in MDaemon. MDaemon has layered security in terms of the number of security features that a message must pass through before that message can be delivered. There are a variety of different security features that are in different categories like anti-spoofing, anti-abuse, which we'll talk about. Simple archiving that will archive messages to either a designated email address or to designated folders. An instant messaging application called MDaemon Instant Messenger that uses the industry standard XMPP protocol. So there's an application we have with MDaemon, our standalone MDaemon Instant Messenger, which allows your users to chat with each other. And it also has a feature that will stand as a mail client to notify you via MDaemon Webmail if you have new email messages. Of course, because instant messaging in MDaemon supports the XMPP protocol, users can also use third-party XMPP or chat clients like Trillion, Adium, and various others that we have out there. MDaemon is compatible with Outlook using, depending on what features you want. So if you want Exchange-like features, Exchange-like collaboration, we have MDaemon Connector for Outlook. We also have ActiveSync connectivity with Outlook, as well as your standard POP and IMAP support. And MDaemon includes a remote web-based administration interface that includes traffic and mailbox charts and things like that that you can access using a web browser from any location. So MDaemon is easy to manage and administer. It includes email and groupware synchronization, so IMAP, POP, ActiveSync. It supports CalDAV and CardDAV for synchronization of calendar events and address books, contacts, and things like that on a variety of mobile devices. Easy data integration using Active Directory or an LDAP database or what we call the Minger protocol. The Minger protocol is a proprietary protocol that allows MDaemon servers to communicate with each other. That is primarily used when you use a feature we have called domain sharing, which allows you to share a single domain across 2 or more MDaemon servers, hosting a different set of accounts at each location. As far as Active Directory integration, MDaemon can query Active Directory, but Active Directory is not required because MDaemon does have its own built-in user database, which we'll talk about. MDaemon has a powerful mailing list engine. It has features such as per user filtering, so per user mail IMAP filters and so forth. Automated configuration backup, so MDaemon can back up your configuration files at regular intervals. These files are where all of your important settings are stored. You can manage your mail queues with MDaemon Remote Administration, so it's all accessible from a web browser. Of course, there's another interface that we'll talk about that's called the console, which we'll get to a few slides later. MDaemon is, in terms of security, they're an industry leader in security, comparable to any of the big name players out there. So integrated spam filtering, SSL and TLS support, PGP encryption, anti-relay controls, SMTP authentication. There's a feature we have called Bayesian learning, which is basically using artificial intelligence to train the spam filter by feeding it samples of spam or non-spam messages. These samples are fed to a database to train the spam filter to become more accurate over time. Of course, your anti-spoofing features like DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, a versatile content filter. There's a feature we have called IP shielding, which can help against spoofing. A feature called backscatter protection, vouch by reference or VPR certification, account hijack detection, and Spambot detection. We'll talk about many of these security features in this presentation. MDaemon's web-based administration interface allows you access to most of MDaemon's settings, like if you want to add or remove accounts, set up domains, configure folder sharing, mailing lists, manage your mail queues, manage all of your security settings, your spam filtering and anti-relay settings, and so forth, your logs and configuration files. Basically, anything you need to administer MDaemon, you can do from your web browser with a couple of exceptions, which we'll talk about. We want to make it as easy as possible to migrate accounts over and data over to MDaemon from other mail server products out there. So if you have a customer who's currently using Microsoft Exchange and they want to get off Exchange and save some money and go to a much less expensive, easier to manage platform such as MDaemon, we have an application called MD Migrator that you can use to migrate that data from an Exchange server. This application will import your email accounts from Exchange, mailing lists, calendar items, contacts, and tasks, and so forth. When you install MDaemon, this application, you can find it in a folder called app or app, which I'll show you a little bit later on. Now, if you're migrating from a non-Exchange server, as long as that server supports ActiveSync protocols version 14.1 and up, then you can migrate using the ActiveSync migration client. So if you have a customer who's on a Cario or an iSwarp or anything else that supports, even a G Suite, as long as it supports ActiveSync, you can use the ActiveSync migration client to migrate over from that mail server. So whether you use this feature, this ActiveSync migration client, or whether you use MD Migrator, we have knowledge-based articles on our website at mdaemon.com that will walk you through the process of how to do the migration. I won't talk too much about the MDaemon system requirements because they are available on our website, but I will just mention that about a year or two ago, we started making MDaemon 64-bit only. It is a Windows-based mail server, so you'll need a Windows computer to install it on. And other than that, depending on how many users you have, as long as you meet the minimum system requirements, which you can see here, of course, more RAM is always better. Faster hard drives would be better as well. MDaemon reads and writes a lot of data to disk. So especially in today's age of solid state drives, that can really help improve performance. But this information is on our website under the products tab. There's also a system recommendations page on our website that you can use to kind of do some modeling based on the number of users that you anticipate having. And it'll give you a suggestion of what type of system we recommend, like how much RAM to have, how much hard drive space to have, things like that. The MDaemon interface comes in two varieties. There's the web-based interface or MDaemon Remote Administration, which you see on the left. And there is the original interface, what we call the console, which you see on the right. Most of the time, you can use remote administration to perform most tasks, but there are a couple of things that are unique to remote administration, and there are a couple of things that are unique to the console, which I'll talk about. For example, in remote administration, the features that are unique to the web-based remote administration are the ability to use custom webmail branding. So as a company hosting their own MDaemon server might want to upload their own company logo that shows up in their webmail client, in MDaemon Webmail. This is where they can do that in remote administration using the image you see on the left. And the other feature unique to remote administration would be the traffic and mailbox charts, which you see in the image on the right. Now, in what we call the MDaemon console, and by the way, to access the console, you go to your start menu, you go to the MDaemon folder, and you'd click on open an MDaemon configuration session. That's what that's called to access the console. But the two primary features that you'll get to in the console are the PGP encryption settings. These PGP encryption settings, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later, are not included in remote administration, but you can get to them through the console. And then on the right-hand side, you have a very useful tool called Queue and Statistics Manager, which is useful for troubleshooting mail delivery issues. You can use it to take, for example, an MDaemon log file, and it will itemize all the mail sessions that it found in that particular log file and list them for you so that you can click on a single mail session to see the SMTP in and out transcript for that particular session for troubleshooting purposes. So those are the main differences between the remote administration and the console. One of the key benefits of MDaemon is its simple file structure, which makes it easy to backup and restore. So for example, when you install MDaemon, it installs everything in a folder under the MDaemon folder, and you have your key configuration files in the app or app directory. You have your email messages stored in the users directory. Now, underneath that users directory is going to be a folder for each of your domains, and then inside each domain's folder is a folder for each of your users where all of your email messages are stored. In fact, if you notice the screenshot on the right, you'll see a user's mailbox folder showing that user's IMAP folders, as well as in the bottom right-hand corner, those MSG files. Those are the email messages sitting in that user's mailbox. Now, also, we'll talk about key configuration files that you'll find inside the MDaemon app or app directory. This is the alias.dat file, which contains a list of all of your aliases, which you can configure through the MDaemon interface as well. You don't have to configure it through these text files. There is a cfilter executable file, which is used by your content filter. There's a file called cfrules.dat. When you create content filter rules, which you would do through the security menu in MDaemon, those rules are written to this plain text file called cfrules.dat. It's useful to become familiar with this file because there might be a situation where you want to create a complex content filtering rule that uses regular expressions or some type of elaborate syntax. If you have that kind of a need, you can reach out to our support staff and they can write a content filter rule for you and just have you personalize it for your business and then copy it and paste it into the cfrules.dat file. So that's why it's useful to be familiar with this file, the cfrules.dat. There is the MDaemon.ini file, which is a very important file that stores key MDaemon preferences and as well as your MDaemon product keys. I recommend that you become familiar with this file. Open it up in Notepad and scroll down because there's a section in this file. And like I said, I don't remember if I have it in this PowerPoint, but it's called directories. And it will have a line for, okay, where's your inbound queue located? Where is your local queue, your remote? Where are your mail queues located? Where are your log files located? You can modify this file, this MDaemon.ini file, if you want to put your mail queues in a different physical drive, if you want to put your MDaemon logs in a different physical drive, like you've got a separate drive letter mapped, like a D drive or a G drive, you can make changes to the MDaemon.ini file to put certain types of data on different drives. So very important file to become familiar with. There is the MDaemon executable file, which you won't normally necessarily need to interact with this file at all. The only time you might is if you are troubleshooting the MDaemon system service, which brings me to the MD launch.executable file. When you launch MDaemon, it triggers this file, mdlaunch.exe, which launches MDaemon as a system service that runs in the background. There is another executable called mdstats.exe. This is the executable that launches a tool we have called Queue and Statistics Manager. This is actually that tool that I showed you a couple of slides ago when I was talking about what you can access through the console that you cannot access through remote administration. I'll have another example of that when I talk about troubleshooting mail delivery issues. And you'll never need to really double click on this file because you can get to it from within the MDaemon configuration session interface, but it's useful to know where it is. Now, this is a very important file, userlist.dat. This is basically your database of where your accounts are stored. There's a specific format that this file is written in that I'll show you on another slide I have coming up. When you add a user in MDaemon, that user or a line representing that user gets added to the userlist.dat file. Now we'll talk about collaboration features. So MDaemon supports collaboration for Outlook users using the MDaemon Connector for Outlook plugin, which is a separately licensed feature. So MDaemon Connector for Outlook opens up the basically exchange-like groupware and collaboration features for Outlook users. It allows them to access their shared and public calendars, contacts, tasks, and notes, and so forth. Now, keep in mind, Outlook users are not just limited to MDaemon Connector for Outlook. They can also connect via ActiveSync if they are using Outlook 2013 and up. Outlook users using ActiveSync will be able to access similar features. I'll have a slide coming up that shows you exactly what features you can access for each connection type. Also related to collaboration is MDaemon Webmail, which of course you access through your web browser, and it has all those same features: email, calendars, contacts, tasks, notes, as well as access to documents, voice memos, all kinds of different features that I like. For example, I use MDaemon Webmail all the time. I don't even use Outlook anymore because the Webmail client has everything I need. with MDaemon Connector and with MDaemon Webmail, you can configure customized folder sharing permission levels. So if a user wants to grant another user permissions to a shared folder, they can specify what level they want to grant that user, such as full access, read only, they can see it, they can't write to it, read or write, things like that. So when we talk about Outlook integration, again, using MDaemon Connector for Outlook, full integration with email, calendars, contacts, tasks, notes, and so forth, using your default IMAP ports. Of course, it supports SSL and TLS, which we certainly recommend this day and age, especially for encrypted connections. So again, MDaemon Connector is a licensed feature. You can purchase MDaemon Connector for, say, a specific number of users. There are two components to MDaemon Connector. There's the component that you enable on the MDaemon server by checking a checkbox. And again, when you check that box for the first time to enable it, which again, I'll show you coming up, MDaemon will ask you if you want to run a 30-day trial at first, and then it'll ask for your purchase MDaemon Connector. But that's on the server side. And then on the client side, there is an MDaemon Connector plugin that your users can download from our website or from within MDaemon Webmail. So this is what the plugin looks like on an Outlook client. This is an older, a little bit older version of Outlook, so newer versions look a little bit different, but the toolbar looks the same. It provides access to your public and shared folders, public and shared calendars, contacts, tasks, notes, as you see here. MDaemon Connector users can configure folder sharing levels to share their email, calendars, contacts, tasks, and notes folders. And it supports side-by-side calendar view, which is pretty standard. So if you have a public calendar and you've got your own personal calendar, you can view them side by side. MDaemon Connector has an out-of-office autoresponder that users can enable. They can enter macros. So for example, where it says Dear Sender right here, it'll populate the email sender's name, the recipient's name, and then you can automate when this autoresponder is enabled or disabled via the start and end dates. You can also enable mail forwarding using the autoresponder. So you've got a variety of things you can do with the autoresponder in MDaemon Connector. Now, on those users who have installed the MDaemon Connector client or plugin, they will be able to set up their MDaemon Connector account by going through the client configuration screen that you see here. So for example, they would enter their username and their password, and they can click on this button that says Test and Get Account Settings. So we introduced a feature a few versions ago that allows administrators to push MDaemon Connector settings out to users. A few years ago, that wasn't available, and MDaemon Connector users had to enter all of that information manually. Now that information can be pushed out. And so that's why the user has this option to click on Test and Get Account Settings, where it'll automatically populate the incoming mail server, the outgoing mail server, organization name, and things like that. So on the Advanced tab, this is where we can configure what ports to use, whether to use SSL or TLS, and so forth. And MDaemon Connector uses a local cache file stored on each individual's local computer. It's called localcache.db. That stores a cached copy of the messages to make it faster to launch MDaemon Connector and interact with MDaemon with Outlook using MDaemon Connector. Now notice these purge buttons here. If a user, no, they're grayed out, but if a user closed out of Outlook and they went to the mail control panel in Windows, these buttons would be available where they can purge the database or compact the local cache database to help keep MDaemon Connector performing smoothly. Because if this local cache database file gets too big, too unwieldy, it can slow down Outlook performance. So that's when we have these options here to purge the database or even compact the database at regular intervals. So I recommend using these features to keep Outlook performing well for MDaemon Connector users. Of course, if you have users who prefer not to use MDaemon Connector, like I said, they can use ActiveSync as well. On the server side, as an administrator, you can go into Remote Administration. Notice here we have the main tab selected. So you've got your top level of navigation in Remote Administration. And then depending on what menu item you click on, you have a secondary level of navigation and then a third level of navigation. In this example, I've clicked on the main menu, I've clicked on MDaemon Connector, and I've clicked on server settings. And we check the box to enable MDaemon Connector support. If you're doing, like I said, if you're doing this for the first time, it's going to ask you if you want to start a 30-day free trial unless you've already purchased MDaemon Connector. And then you can click on this green button to generate the MDaemon Connector shared folders. You can check this button right here, authorized accounts, to configure or specify what users are authorized to use MDaemon Connector. And you can see on the right-hand side, you can type the address in the blank provided, and then simply click on Add, or you can click on this big green button to allow all accounts to connect using MDaemon Connector. Then you can click on the Client Settings menu and click this button to specify the client settings that you wish to push out to MDaemon Connector clients. So this is what that looks like here. You have a configuration screen with a number of different tabs right here. So you've got your General tab, which has your username, email address, account settings, which says MDaemon Connector, the server information, the login information. And notice these have macros. So this is going to automatically populate with the user's username. Now the username for login purposes for MDaemon is always going to be the email address. And then you have the email macro, which will also populate the email address. The server information, the FQDN, this is the fully qualified domain name. So for example, mail.example.com or whatever your company name is will populate there, as well as your login information, the email address and so forth. Under the Advanced tab, so you can specify whether or not to use SSL or TLS. You have under the Folder tab, whether to show all folders or only show subscribed folders. You have a Send Receive tab that you can configure. So again, I'm showing you this because these settings are pushed out to those Outlook users using MDaemon Connector for Outlook. And as an administrator, you may want to be able to control that. Of course, if you don't need that control, you want to allow your users to configure it themselves, that's an option for you as well. Under the Send Receive tab, there's an option to download headers only. I would probably recommend leaving this box checked in most cases, because without this box checked, if a user is launching Outlook for the first time, it might be slow to load when using MDaemon Connector. Downloading just the headers will make it launch a lot faster. And then if a user wants to read an email message, they can double click on that message in their inbox and pull it up. And at that time, the headers are downloaded. So it's a way to improve performance. And you've got miscellaneous settings like whether or not to send red receipts, local cache options here. Database settings, such as purging the database when Outlook shut down. Again, this is that local cache.db file I was talking about. And compacting the database, again, to keep it manageable to help improve performance. And you also have the option to push a signature out to Outlook users using MDaemon Connector. So if you have a corporate signature, you can specify that signature in the blank provided, and it will get appended to all outbound messages coming from those MDaemon Connector users. If you're confused on what features are accessible by which connection type, this can help shed some light on that. Notice the column here, MDaemon ActiveSync, and then you've got MDaemon Connector for Outlook, EM Client, MDaemon Webmail, and straight IMAP. The first two columns, MDaemon ActiveSync and MDaemon Connector for Outlook, as you can see, they all have access to emails, calendars, contacts, tasks, notes, as well as public folders, shared folders. There are a couple of differences between the two. Notice in the first column, MDaemon ActiveSync, those users do not have the ability to manage folder permissions for folder sharing purposes using ActiveSync, while MDaemon Connector users do have that ability through the MDaemon Connector toolbar from within Outlook. Now, this is really not that big of a deal because those Outlook users who are connecting to ActiveSync, if they want to manage folder permissions, even though they can't do that through Outlook using an ActiveSync connection method, they can still log into MDaemon Webmail and configure folder permissions that way. So if you've got users who really need those collaboration features, you've got two options for your Outlook users, MDaemon Connector or ActiveSync. And they're very similar, but you might prefer one or the other depending on features. Like if you really need your users to be able to configure an out-of-office autoresponder via Outlook, even though they can do that in Webmail, then you might recommend MDaemon Connector for Outlook. So this will help you make that decision. Also, MDaemon supports EM Client. You can see the different features that EM Client users have access to. MDaemon Webmail and the features they have, again, shared folders, shared calendars, contacts, tasks, notes. Straight IMAP connections, that last column on the right-hand side, a straight IMAP connection to MDaemon is only going to be able to get their email. If they need access to shared and public folders, they will only be able to access mail folders, not calendars, contacts, task notes. So use this as your guide when you're recommending for your customers what connection method to use. Now we're getting into MDaemon server settings, right? So we're going to talk about various different configuration features and security features and just a variety of settings that you'll want to be familiar with when configuring MDaemon. One of them, for example, which you see under the Setup tab at the very top, see where my mouse is, where it says Setup. And then we have a server settings menu, and then down here we have delivery. This is where, under the message routing, you can choose whether to send directly to the receiving mail server, which is the standard, or send outbound through a smart host. So this is where you configure a default smart host. If you have 1, 2, 3, or more domains in MDaemon, each domain can have its own smart host. If a domain doesn't have its own smart host, but you want to use a smart host, then the default smart host that you list here will be used. So your smart host could be, for example, a secure email gateway, like our product security gateway, for example. Now, notice, by the way, if I back up, I've selected the section option where it says send all app mail to a smart host. And on the right-hand side, I've added a default smart host. I've got the IP address of the smart host. That smart host requires SMTP authentication, so I've got a username and a password here. Everything that you do in MDaemon, all these settings are written to configuration files. And in this particular case, when you configure a default smart host, and remember earlier when I was talking about the MDaemon INI file and how I mentioned how important it is? This is one example. This is the MDaemon.ini file, and your default smart host is written right here under the domain section. So if you need to back up those settings, for example, you can back up the MDaemon.ini file and then restore it if you need to. You also have access to your port configuration. So if you needed to change what ports MDaemon is listing on, you can do that here. And those port designation settings are also written to the MDaemon.ini file, again, located in the MDaemon app directory or app directory under the ports section, as you see right here where my mouse is. There is a feature we have called sessions. So the session screen allows you to configure how many concurrent SMTP outbound sessions are running at any given time, how many inbound sessions are running, how many sessions can be run on the MSA or Message Submission Agent port. That's port 587, I believe. So this is useful for avoiding situations such as a user tries to connect and check their mail, and they get a message that says, sorry, server too busy. Well, if you get that, if a user is getting server too busy, you can try coming here and increasing the maximum concurrent SMTP inbound sessions. But if you do that, I recommend that you only do it in small increments. Try 5 at a time. So change it from 50 to 55. Also, keep in mind, you can raise this number a lot more if you have a lot more RAM installed in your system. So, like if you've got a server with 64 gigs of RAM, a lot more RAM can accommodate a lot more sessions at any given time. So that certainly helps. But if you have limited resources, you might experiment with lowering these values. However, the default values should work for you in most situations. Those settings, those maximum session settings, are stored also in the MDaemon.ini file under the sessions section, which you see here. MDaemon also supports public folders. So under the setup menu, under public folders, you have your public folder manager where you can add calendar, contacts, tasks, notes, email folders, and designate who has access to these public folders. You can specify or select a folder and click on Edit Access Control to specify folder permissions. And notice on the left-hand side, what we see on the left where it says Edit Access Control, you see all the different users who have access to this folder. And you see the letters representing the different levels of access for this folder. So, for example, lookup, read, write, these LRWIP, lookup, read, write, insert, post. That's what all of these mean. You can click on a particular user or add a new user or email address with a new button, and on the right-hand side, check the box for each level of access you wish to grant that user for this particular folder. When you do create a public folder, inside the MDaemon file structure, you've got an MDaemon folder, and inside that, you have a public folders directory, and I've created a folder in this particular case called tickets.imap, where my mouse is right here. Inside every IMAP folder is a file called highwater.mrk. This file is the configuration file that contains the access rights that you've just configured on that previous screen. So as you can see, we've got this access control section here, and we have the users who have access to the folder with the different access control permissions listed right here in this highwater.mrk file. You also have access to your domain manager via main domain manager as shown here. This is where you go to manage a variety of different settings on a per domain basis. So for example, host name, IP address, smart host, and a variety of other different settings that you have here. So for example, on this particular window on the right-hand side, you've got your host name and IP address that you can configure, as you see here. You can configure a smart host on a per domain basis. Remember, I just talked about the default smart host. This is where you go to configure your per domain smart host. But when you do configure a per domain smart host, so you check this box right here, it says configure a smart host for this domain, and enter your smart host name or IP address here. When you do that, those settings are written to a file inside the MDaemon app directory or app directory called domains.dat. And it's listed right here where it says smart host name equals, and I've got, for example, mail.myisp.test. That's the smart host for that particular domain. The actual name of the domain, by the way, if you scroll up in this file, like I have a domain called example.com, it'll have it in brackets. So there's a section that says example.com, and there's one for each of your domains. That's where you find these settings. You can configure calendar settings for MDaemon Webmail and MDaemon Connector on a per domain basis. Some countries recognize Monday as the first day of the week. Some recognize Sunday as the first day of the week. You can configure those settings here. You can also configure per domain plain text and HTML signatures on a per domain basis, as you see here via the signatures menu. And you can configure per domain account and mail pruning settings. For example, if an account has been inactive for a given period of time, messages that are older than a given number of days, deleted IMAP folders that are older than a certain number of days. You can specify a maximum message size for authenticated senders. So if you need to place size limits on a per domain basis, you can do that for authenticated senders as well as all other senders, as you see here. And then, of course, we have some features that are grayed out. These features toward the bottom on the right-hand side are available for companies who are hosting using MDaemon Private Cloud. It's another version of MDaemon that we have for cloud hosting providers. So you've got some cloud-only features here for hosting providers. You can configure ActiveSync settings on a per domain basis. So whether or not ActiveSync is enabled based on each domain, whether or not an ActiveSync policy has been assigned for that domain, that'll show up here under ActiveSync menu where it says top level where it says ActiveSync under domain management. And you can configure ActiveSync client settings on a per domain basis. So troubleshooting, you can configure a logging level. Normally, you would not need to have debug logging selected under log level. You could have normal logging. But if you need to troubleshoot an ActiveSync connection issue, for example, you can turn on debug logging. If you need to reach out to our support staff to troubleshoot an ActiveSync issue, they may ask you to turn on debug logging. This is where you go to do it. Creating task reminders for flagged mail items. Notice it says inherit from global. So you've got 3 levels of settings for ActiveSync client settings. You've got the global settings under the main ActiveSync configuration menu. You've got the domain level settings that you see here under this domain, which says domain3.com. And then you can also configure a 3rd level down on a per account basis as well. So when it says inherit from global, this is where it inherits the global settings. If you're doing this for a specific account, configuring ActiveSync settings, there's an option that says inherit from domain, for example. And on the right-hand side, just additional settings you can configure, like enforcing protocol restrictions, disallowing factory reset wipes, allowed senders folders, blocked senders, and things like that. So all different settings you can configure for your ActiveSync clients. You can configure ActiveSync policies. So when you install MDaemon, it comes with 3 predefined ActiveSync policies: unsecured, 4-digit PIN required, or password required. But you can create your own ActiveSync policy as well. So I've got one here called test policy. Under client management, you can see the different mobile devices that are connected via ActiveSync. You can see their email address, What type of device is it? Samsung. I've got a Samsung phone, for example. I've got an Outlook client. If you have an iPhone user, they'll show up here. You will see the device ID. If there's a policy assigned, you'll see that here in the operating system. This device ID information, by the way, might be useful if you need to configure protocol restrictions. You can do that for specific device IDs. All those settings that you have for your domain manager, you can find under the domains.dat file inside the MDaemon APP directory. So here's the example.com domain. You've got all the domain specific settings located here. You can manage all of your accounts via the main menu under Account Manager. This screen is going to show you under the status column, the yellow lightning bolt indicates an administrator. The green check mark indicates a regular user. The blue circle indicates an MDaemon Connector user. The image of a mobile device that indicates an ActiveSync user. And then, of course, you've got your mailbox name, your domain, the real name assigned to the user. If the user has been assigned to any groups, which we'll talk about when I go into the concept of groups and templates, they'll be listed here. I've got a group called clients, for example. You can see when an account last checked their email or last logged in. You can see how many messages are in an account's inbox. Notice the ones that have a slash, like the second one, 27/1000. I've assigned a quota for this particular user of no more than 1,000 messages. So this person has 27 out of 1,000 messages in their inbox. That's what that slash means there. And then how much disk space is used for the account in megabytes. Under the account details menu, when you go to an account, you go to the account details menu. You can enable, disable, or freeze the account using the options right here. An account that is frozen as opposed to disabled can receive mail. The mail can be collected in the account's inbox, but the user will not be able to check their mail, nor will they be able to send outbound mail. That's what a frozen account is. Or you can choose to disable the account altogether. On the right-hand side, you also have options to change the mailbox password for an account. Notice, by the way, we have a password strength meter to encourage the use of stronger passwords. You can check this box to require the user to change their password the next time they log into their account. You also can see the most recent times that a user logged into MDaemon Webmail. Also under the account details screen as shown here, it shows you when, as well as the IP address that they logged in from. And under the Web Services tab, this is where you can specify whether or not the user can use MDaemon Webmail, whether they can use MDaemon Remote Administration. Now, of course, a user who has access to remote administration is not going to have access to all the features that an administrator has access to. They can go in, though, and configure their out-of-office autoresponder or anything else that an administrator has given them access to. Under the account manager, under administrative roles, if you want to add another user or delegate administrative access to another user, you can make that user a global administrator or a domain administrator where they only have access to domain-specific settings. Under setup, account settings, passwords, you can configure require strong passwords. Passwords must contain a special character, the minimum password length. There's a bad passwords file, this blue button where my mouse is, edit the bad passwords file. This is a file that allows you to put in like the word password. If you don't want users to use any variation of the word password or the word let me in or whatever, you can use the bad password file and add that to the bad password file. That means they can't enter the word password, whether it's capital, lowercase, or whether it contains numbers, letters. They can't use any variation of that. So this is a useful tool to keep users from using easily guessed or hacked passwords. You can also force weak passwords to change, and you can generate a weak password report if you have any users who are using weak passwords, so you can stay on top of password security to ensure that users are using strong passwords. And on the right-hand side, you can configure password expiration settings, password warning when a password is about to expire, and things like that. Now, this screen I'm showing you here pertains to the basic user database for MDaemon. So when you add users in MDaemon, they're stored in a file called userlist.dat, which is a file that you'll find inside the MDaemon app or APP directory. Notice the layout of this file. Now, this top image where my mouse is where with word wrap turned off. The lower image is with word wrap turned on, so you can see all the different fields, like the directory where the user's mailbox is located, the username, the domain, and so forth. I bring this up because, well, number one, you can back up and restore your user database by backing up and restoring this file. It's going to back up and restore the user's database, but not the user email messages. Those are stored inside the MDaemon users directory. But notice the spacing on this file. If you happen to make any edits to this file, just make sure you don't hit spacebar or delete and get any of these lines off their proper spacing, because if you do, it can cause accounts to not show up properly in MDaemon. So always make a backup copy of this file if you need to do any manual edits to this file, which chances are you will never need to do. The only time you might is if you want to put a couple of specific users' email folders on a different physical drive. Now we have two features that work together called groups and templates. Account templates allow administrators to configure settings for entire groups of accounts via a single configuration screen. So I'm just going to walk you through the process, and I think it'll make more sense. So for example, under account templates, under the main menu, we click on new to create a template. And I'm going to call this template 2. And then what we do is we check off the box for each setting or list of settings that we want to be controlled by the template. In this particular case, I want to be able to control quotas for this template. Now, again, this is going to allow me to configure a mailbox quota and apply it to multiple accounts at a single time without having to go to every account and configure quota settings for each specific account. And this will start to make more sense when I talk about groups. Now that, by the way, we've checked this quotas box, I can click on quotas here, and I can specify, okay, I only want 500 messages to be allowed in the mailbox at any given time, right? Now, remember, I checked the quotas box. I did not check the forwarding box. So if I tried to make any forwarding configuration settings within this template, they're grayed out because I didn't specify that I wanted to be able to control forwarding settings from this template, only quotas. So these settings, forwarding, you can still control by going to each individual account and configuring folder settings there. So now we need to determine which accounts are controlled by this template, and you can do that using groups. So now, again, under the main menu, we were just under account templates. Now we're under groups, and we have two groups here. I've got one called clients and one called contractors. Let's say I create a new group. I'm going to call this group 1, right? I'm going to give it a description. And then I can check this box that says apply this account template to this group. This is optional, of course, but I've got that template that I just created where I was controlling those quota settings, and I call it template 2. So that's where you go to apply that template to this particular group. But then you can also click on this button, edit group membership, to add specific group members to this group so you can specify who's being controlled by that template and who's being included in this group. So now, when we edit the group membership, we go in, we check the box for each member we wish to add to this group, and then we can close out the window here. So now the new group has been added with the assigned template, as you can see here. Like you'll find throughout this presentation, all these settings have a corresponding configuration file where the settings are stored. Like I said, you won't necessarily need to interact with these files most of the time, but it's useful to know where they are. So those templates are stored in a file called accounttemplates.dat inside the MDaemon APP directory, as you can see here. And this is what that file looks like. So I've got that template that I created called template 1 right here. And these are all the different settings that have been configured for this particular template. Now we'll talk about security settings, and we'll start with the spam filter. Under filter settings, there's a menu called Heuristic Engine. This is your basic spam filter configuration setting, right? So you have this checkbox to enable your heuristic engine, or basically this is what you enable, which is checked by default to enable the spam filter in MDaemon. Notice these two different scoring thresholds. You've got this setting, a message is spam if it scores greater or equal to, and we have 5 points. And then we have this setting, SMTP rejects messages with scores greater than or equal to, and it says 12. Now, notice that 12 is higher than 5. That's because when an email first arrives, an inbound email first arrives, it goes into a temporary queue, and MDaemon does an initial scan at that time using Spam Assassin, and it assesses a scoring value. At that time, if it scores 12 or below, Then the message gets passed on to what we call a queue-based scan, right? So that second scan, based on additional testing, that scoring value can go up or down. And at that time, if that scoring value is a 5 or above, then the message gets handled based on the settings you have on the right-hand side, what to do with spam. For example, delete it immediately, put it in the spam trap public folder, or flag the message and let it continue down the delivery path. I didn't need to cover that with my label there, but that third item says flag the message, but let it continue down the delivery path. This is where my mouse is here. Spam filter configuration settings are stored in another configuration file inside the MDaemon Spam Assassin directory. So inside this Spam Assassin folder is a folder called rules. And inside that is a file called local.cf. This is where your primary spam scoring values are stored. Again, this is another file you may never need to interact with manually, but it's useful just to know if you ever need to back up these settings, you can back up this file. By the way, all these files that you see here inside the Spam Assassin rules directory, that blacklist.cf, report.cf, scores, whitelist, especially the scores.cf and the local.cf file, this is not unique to MDaemon. This is a Spam Assassin feature. So other mail servers that use Spam Assassin, you'll see these similar files. So if you need help with any of these scoring values, you can also go out to the Spam Assassin website and get data on these configuration files. So it's not unique to MDaemon here. There's also MDaemon Antivirus. So MDaemon Antivirus is another licensed feature. With antivirus, when purchasing antivirus, we recommend purchasing to accommodate at least the same number of users that you're supporting in MDaemon, and no less, no fewer. But with MDaemon Antivirus, it includes two antivirus engines, ClamAV and Icarus. And using these settings here, you can choose what to do when a message is infected with a virus, such as do nothing, and handle it via the content filter, delete the message, or quarantine it to a designated folder, or delete the infected attachments. You've got a lot of control as an administrator for infected attachments. There's also a on-demand mailbox scanning feature that you can click on at any given time to do a rescan of all of your mailboxes to ensure that they don't have any malware, that no email messages came through that have any malware or viruses. Your antivirus logging activity, if you needed to troubleshoot antivirus activity or just kind of see what antivirus scanning activities are taking place, you can go to your logs menu here in Remote Administration, click on log files, and there's a file called the MDaemon Antivirus log file, and it will show you with every mail session, MDaemon antivirus processing, for example, right? So here's an email message that is sitting in the local queue. It says see MDaemon queues local. This is the file name of the message that is currently being scanned by antivirus. And you can see where it says start MDaemon antivirus results. And you've got your Icarus results. This message was clean. You've got your ClamAV results as well. Total attachments scanned, total attachments infected, total attachments disinfected, any errors while scanning, any attachments removed. So this is your antivirus scanning data written to the MDaemon antivirus log file. There's a feature called dynamic screening. The primary feature of dynamic screening is authentication failure tracking. This will detect if a hacker is trying to guess passwords for your accounts and they try too many times to log into an account using an incorrect password. Dynamic screening will catch that activity and then block the offending sender address for a given period of time, or freeze the offending address or the offending IP address for a given period of time. And then each consecutive attempt that they try to make, they can get frozen or blocked for an incrementally longer period of time. So actually, I meant to hit next, and this kind of just reiterates what I was just explaining. So you can block the IP address after a given number of authentication failures. You can freeze an account after a given number of authentication failures. Now, again, remember, frozen accounts can receive mail, but the user cannot check for new mail or send outbound mail. These are the protocols that are checked during dynamic screening, so SMTP, POP, IMAP, and you can choose whether or not to scan or analyze certain protocols for dynamic screening using these checkboxes here. There are dynamic screening reporting and notification settings. When an account is blocked by dynamic screening, the administrator and or the involved user can be notified when a certain given number of failed authentication attempts takes place. This will notify the administrator, for example, to change the password or require the user to change their password. Just keep an eye on it for security purposes. MDaemon includes mail relay settings. So MDaemon does not relay mail by default, relaying being delivering mail that is neither from nor to a local user. These boxes that I'm highlighting here are checked by default, so do not allow message relaying. SMTP mail address must exist if it uses a local domain. That's the sender, the mail from. SMTP RCPT address must exist if it uses a local domain. So that's the recipient or the recipient RCPT too. I would recommend that we always leave these three boxes checked to prevent unnecessary relaying, because relaying, if your mail server is an open relay, that can quickly get you placed on a DNS block list, and we don't want that. So make sure these boxes are checked. There's a feature called IP shielding, in which you can specify IP addresses or ranges of IP addresses that mail must have come from if mail claims to be sent from a particular domain. So for example, standard practice would be to put your local domain and then list the IP addresses on your local network for people who are sending internally from within the office. And then mail from those designated IP addresses are not subject to extra security features. It's an extra way to authenticate. This is also useful if you have like a printer, a network connected printer, or other device that is sending out mail legitimately for your domain, but is not capable of using industry standard SMTP authentication. You can make exceptions for those as long as they come from an authorized IP address. MDaemon can perform reverse lookups on incoming connections to help protect against receiving mail from spoofed email, spoofed senders. So it can perform a reverse PTR record lookup on inbound connections, a lookup on the HELO or EHLO domain. That's the hello command, basically, that a server sends to a receiving server when they're initiating an SMTP mail transfer connection or session. And then performing a lookup on the value passed in the mail command or the mail from command as well. So it's an anti-spoofing feature to help protect against spoofing. There's another feature we have called POP before SMTP. Just like with that IP shielding, it's a feature that allows you to have another alternative to SMTP authentication. POP before SMTP requires a user to hit the send receive button basically on their mail client or check for new mail before they can send outbound mail. So the process of hitting that send receive button or checking for new mail essentially authenticates them. And that allows them to send outbound mail without using your industry standard SMTP authentication, because they authenticated by hitting the send receive button to check mail on the inbound side. You have a trusted host screen under security settings, trusted hosts, that you can enter the host names of servers that you trust. This doesn't exempt them from all security features. Mail from those trusted hosts will still get scanned by the spam filter or various other security features. However, many security features have a setting that says, do not apply this particular security feature to mail coming from trusted hosts. So that's what that is used for. So you've got your SMTP authentication settings here under the Security Sender Authentication menu. This box is checked by default. Authentication is always required when mail is sent from a local account. So we recommend that you always have this box checked so that your users are required to authenticate via a proper username and password. There's a feature called SMTP screening that will block connections based on their behavior. Servers that connect too many times in a given time frame, IP addresses that cause a certain number of failed RCPT commands or recipient commands. In other words, they're sending out email to your server that has a bunch of recipients that are not valid on your server. They're basically trying to spam your server, or they're trying to connect too many times in a given time frame to try to find other ways to hack into your server. Or this third option down here, IPs that send a certain number of reset commands. A sending server might issue a reset command to try to keep a mail session or an SMTP session open longer while they try other ways to try to exploit your server. This SMTP screening feature will detect that type of activity and block it, close the SMTP session after blocking the IP address to prevent hackers from trying to abuse your system. There's also a feature called Spambot detection, which will detect messages that have the same return path that are sent from multiple IP addresses. So a Spambot, that might be 3, 4, 5 or more mail servers that have been taken over by spammers through whatever means. They've been infected by malware or whatever. And then they start sending out spam. Well, one characteristic could be that the spam that they send out has the same return path. We can detect that type of activity using Spambot detection and then block those servers from trying to send through your MDaemon server. We also have a feature called location screening that will block connections based on country or location. So if you know you don't have any legitimate business with a particular region or country, you can use location screening to block connections from those countries. And the added benefit is that that can also help block additional spam that might originate from that location. Then we have anti-spoofing features such as SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and we'll talk about how each of them works. So now we have a feature called Sender Policy Framework. SPF, or Sender Policy Framework, allows a domain administrator to specify mail servers that are authorized to send mail on behalf of their domain. And it does that using an SPF record that's published to DNS. So the sending organization publishes an SPF record to DNS. Say, for example, your domain is example.com, and you say, I'm allowing these 3 different mail servers to send mail on behalf of my domain. I can do that via an IP address of the server or whatever I'd like. And I'll show an example of this. Then when an email is being sent from that domain, the receiving server looks up the SPF record of the domain taken from the sender of the mail from command to see if that server that was actually connecting is authorized to send on behalf of that domain. And then if the SPF record says that that is not an authorized sender, then the message can be rejected because it failed the SPF, and it can be marked as spam, or it can be accepted if it is validated. In other words, the SPF record does say, yes, the receiving server is legitimately sending mail for that domain. Here's what an SPF record looks like. Every SPF record has a version number, or V equals SPF1. These are the IP addresses that are authorized to send on behalf of the domain. These are ranges of IP addresses. You can also use include statements to include another domain or subdomain's SPF records, for example, spf.example.com instead of just example.com. And then this hyphen or dash all indicates a hard fail. So this is a tag that provides instructions on what recipient should do if SPF record does not match. In this case, hard fail, meaning reject all messages that don't pass SPF. You'll see in the next example that there's one that uses a squiggly line, or we call a tilde, and that's what we call a soft fail, where those can be quarantined as opposed to rejected. Here, for example, this will make more sense. Here's another example. Again, we have the version number SPF1. There's another tag that might be featured in an SPF record, that like the MX tag, that says allow any valid MX records for the domain to send on behalf of the domain. There's an A tag that says allow any valid A records for the domain to send on behalf of the domain. So this particular domain, for example, has 4 valid A records. All of these servers that you see listed here are legitimate senders on behalf of the example.com domain. You can also specify IPv6 addresses that are authorized to send on behalf of the domain. And you have this tilde where it says soft fail, where the message can be accepted, but it can be tagged as suspicious. SPF records can get a little bit more complex as well. There's a website that's openspf.org that has a lot more examples that you can go by. This is just another example of an SPF record that you can see by pulling up a command prompt. You can look up the SPF record of any domain using a command prompt. It's basically a simple text record, as you can see here. SPF verification settings can be found in MDaemon under the Security Sender Authentication menu under SPF verification. So you can check this box to enable SPF verification. And then you can choose what to do when verification returns a fail result, such as send a 550 error code and then close the connection. You can add a given number of points to the message's spam score, as shown here. The next anti-spoofing technology or method we have is called DKIM, which stands for DomainKeys Identified Mail. This works a little bit differently in that it uses a public and private key pair to verify messages that have been cryptographically signed by DKIM. For example, the domain owner publishes a DKIM key to DNS. Now, by the way, MDaemon and Security Gateway or other product can both generate DKIM keys that you can place inside your DNS records. So that's what we call the public key, right? And then when a user under the organization's domain sends an email, the mail server signs that message using the private key that is stored on the mail server, in this case MDaemon. The receiving server sees that the message has been signed by DKIM and then does a query from the sending domain's DNS record to look up the sending domain's public key in DNS. It then compares that public key with the private key that was used to sign the message to see if they match. And if they don't match, the message can be rejected or quarantined, or if they do match, then the message can be accepted or validated. Now, one added benefit of DKIM is, and I don't think I have an example of it coming up, but a message that has been signed by DKIM is going to have a DKIM key in the message headers. It's a long string of characters. What's useful about that is if a message had been modified in any way during the delivery process, that key will change slightly. The receiving server will be able to know that either it was not sent from a legitimate sender of the domain, or it was modified or tampered with during the delivery process. So that's an added benefit of DKIM. And DKIM verification settings can be found in MDaemon under the sender authentication menu, under the security menu as shown here. You can check that box at the top that says enable DKIM verification as shown here. And then finally, there's a technology called DMARC, which stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. DMARC allows domain owners to tell receiving domains, receiving mail servers, how to handle mail claiming to come from their domain that did not properly align with SPF and DKIM. And I'll walk you through it, and it'll make more sense. And I've got a YouTube video out on as well that will go over this in a lot more detail. So the sending domain publishes a DMARC record to DNS, and I'll show you what that looks like coming up. And this record tells receiving domains how to handle messages that don't properly align with DKIM or SPF. So then the sending email server sends an email. The receiving mail server first does an SPF record lookup to see if it came from an authorized sending server. It then checks DKIM to see if the public and private keys align. And then it checks the sending domain's DMARC record to find out how the domain owner wants the receiving mail server or receiving domain to handle messages that don't properly align with SPF or DKIM. And then based on the sending domain's DMARC policy, if they pass SPF and DKIM, then the message can be accepted or validated. The message can be rejected based on the sending domain's DMARC policy, or the message can be quarantined based on the sending domain's DMARC policy. And an added benefit of DMARC is that domain owners can specify where they want forensic and aggregate reports to be sent to, showing them how their domain is being used. It will provide with them a list of email messages claiming to come from their domain, the IP address that they came from, and the result of whether they passed or failed DKIM and SPF. So it allows domain administrators to see what mail servers are sending mail on behalf of their domain so that they can take corrective action if a legitimate mail server is sending out for their domain, but it's not properly configured with DKIM and SPF. Here's an example of what a DMARC record looks like. Just like with that SPF record, it starts with the version number V equals DMARC1. It has a P equals tag. This is the policy. This can be reject, quarantine, or none. In this case, I have a policy of reject. There's an optional tag called the PCT or percent tag. This is a tag that allows you to specify what percentage of messages you want to be handled based on the results. So, for example, if you have a policy of quarantine and you have a percent of 50, what you're saying is you want 50% of the messages that fail DKIM and SPF to be quarantined, the other 50% to be delivered. You might want to have a lower percentage number when you're first deploying DMARC, for example, so that you can make sure that you have your DKIM and SPF records properly configured for all outbound servers. I have a YouTube video that goes over in much more detail DMARC deployment strategy, because there is a strategy to that. There's an RUA tag. This is where aggregate reports are sent to. So reports on how your domain is being used, all the mail servers that are sending on behalf of your domain, as well as the disposition. Was the message delivered? Did it pass or fail DKIM and SPF? There's an RUF tag. This is for forensic or failure reports for messages that failed DMARC or failed SPF and DKIM on behalf of DMARC. This is where those reports get sent to as well. This is what one of those reports looks like. Again, it tells you the IP address that the message came from. Did it pass? Was it delivered? Was it quarantined? Did it pass or fail DKIM or SPF? the SPF domain, the SPF result, was it, did it pass, did it fail, the DKIM domain, DKIM result, and so forth. So this allows you, this is a report that came from, let me see at the top, Google.com. So Google sent back this aggregate report here, this forensic report, to tell me how my domain is being used. DMARC verification settings can be found under the Sender Authentication menu. You can check this box to enable DMARC verification and reporting. And now we move on to another feature. It's called ARC, Authenticated Received Chain. It's an email authentication standard that's designed to verify forwarded or mailing list messages that would otherwise fail DKIM, SPF, and DMARC. For example, let's say an email was sent to me from your domain, and you've got SPF and DKIM properly configured, and you've got DMARC configured, but then I forwarded that email to somebody else. Well, that would break SPF and DKIM because it's being forwarded from a non-authorized mail server. Or let's say the recipient is on a mailing list for the domain. Well, that can also cause a message to fail DKIM and SPF if it's from a mailing list or if it's been forwarded. So ARC is a way to preserve the authentication results in forwarded and mailing list messages. And this will start to make more sense as I go through it here. So this is basically the process. An email is sent from a particular IP address, and it gets sent to an intermediate server which verifies the message. It checks SPM, it checks DKIM, it checks DMARC. And so far so good. It passes all these features. SPF, DKIM, DMARC are passed. Then that intermediate mail server changes the content in some way. It relays it, it makes some kind of a modification, or it forwards it, or whatever. Well, then the recipient mail server receives the message, and it notices that the DKIM content has now failed because the content has changed. SPF has failed because the new IP address that forwarded the message is not an authorized IP address to send on behalf of the sending domain, and therefore DMARC fails. Well, ARC can come in and say, no, this is okay. These are still valid. This is still valid because ARC places additional headers within the message that say, even though it was forwarded, even though it was sent to a mailing list, I can vouch for you that it is still sent from a valid server, and therefore I can validate the authenticity of the message, and then the message can get delivered. ARC adds a number of headers to an email message. There's one called the ARC Authentication Results header, which has a copy of the original authentication results from before any modifications were made by any intermediary mail servers. And I've got an example of it here, this ARC header. Notice I've color-coded various elements so that you'll recognize them because they're present in all of these ARC headers. There's this I equals tag. That's the iteration or the instance number starting at 1 increment for each intermediary server. So if this message had passed through a secondary intermediary server before getting delivered, then that I equals tag would have a number 2 instead of 1. Then it has an MX tag indicating the domain of the first receiving mail server that added the ARC header. Then it has the DKIM and SPF authentication results, as well as the DMARC alignment results, which we just talked about. And it shows that the message originally passed all authentication checks successfully, and therefore any forwarding before any forwarding or mailing list. So far, so good. But as the message travels through more hops, each intermediary server will add a new ARC authentication results header with an incrementing instance number. Again, that's that I equals number that you see here in red. Then there's the ARC message signature header, which allows receivers to validate the ARC chain of trust and verify that the message contents are intact. And this is what that looks like. And I know this is a little bit more advanced, but this will help keep those messages that are forwarded or part of mailing list from being discarded or rejected based on SPF and DKIM. ARC settings are found under the Sender Authentication menu in Remote Administration under ARC settings. You can check the box to enable ARC verification. And these are your trusted ARC, what we call sealers. They're domains whose ARC results you trust. So in order to get a positive benefit from ARC, you'll want to add the domains whose ARC results you trust there. And those that are from non-trusted domains the ARC results are ignored when doing DMARC verification. So it's just revert to your standard DKIM, SPF, and DMARC. And then forwarded messages and mailing list messages, as well as gateway messages with authentication results, are eligible for ARC signing using the options you see on the right-hand side. in order to sign messages with ARC, so if your mail server is forwarding mail from another mail server, right? So your mail server would need to add ARC headers. Then you can use the settings down here to create a selector to add an ARC header for messages that are forwarded from your mail server. So the benefits of ARC are that it aids in troubleshooting and analysis. So it helps you identify all intermediaries that are handling the message based on ARC domains. It isolates authentication failures to a specific hop using instance numbers. So if SPF or DKIM or DMARC is out of alignment on any one of these hops, this can help you troubleshoot that and find out where to make configuration changes. It can help you check for missing sequence numbers indicating that there's a broken ARC chain. And it verifies that ARC seals and signatures are validating properly. It also will compare the original and current authentication results to help identify any changes that are made. Then there's a feature called backscatter protection. So backscatter happens when somebody forges a return path of an outbound message, and that was forged with the email address of one of your users, for example. And then your user starts getting a bunch of bounce back or auto response messages and responses to messages that they never sent in the first place. Backscatter protection adds a special header to the return path, like you see here. It's this PRVS tag, so that when MDaemon receives a bounce back message, it looks for that PRVS tag to verify that that is a legitimate bounce back message. And that's how backscatter protection works. There's a feature called tar pitting that will slow down connections after a specified number of recipient commands. So a number of recipients, spammers trying to send to a bunch of recipients. Tar pitting will slow down that connection to discourage a spammer or a hacker from trying to abuse your server. The premise or the idea being they operate on efficiency. It takes them too long to try to exploit your server. They'll move on to another target. There's a feature called gray listing that will send a temporary try again later message to any connecting servers that are previously unidentified. So it identifies the sender, recipient, and sending IP address. And if it doesn't recognize them for the first time, then it'll say, wait 15 minutes and try again later. Again, this is the idea that spammers will not want to try again. They operate on efficiency. They'll be discouraged. They'll move on to another server. Now, gray listing is disabled by default because it can postpone legitimate mail. There are ways to get around this. So, for example, configuring exceptions for connections using SMTP authentication, connections from trusted hosts, and things like that. Or you can disable gray listing entirely. You can add a site policy that is basically a block of text that is transmitted to the sending mail server at the beginning of each mail session. So, for example, unauthorized relay prohibited. And then there's encryption settings. So now we'll talk about server-side encryption using OpenPGP. This is one of those features that I mentioned earlier are only accessible through the MDaemon console. They're not accessible through MDaemon Remote Administration. And you can access PGP settings through the security menu, as you see here. And on the right-hand side, you have these checkboxes like where you can enable PGP encryption. You can configure who can and cannot use PGP. You can create PGP encryption keys. PGP encryption uses a pair of keys, a public key that's used to encrypt the message, a private key that's used to decrypt the message. So you check this box to enable PGP encryption. We then can specify who can and cannot use PGP using the button here. When you click on that button, you'll see this configuration file. Notice all of these lines with the pound sign in front of them. Those are comments, but they give you a guideline as to how to add entries to this file. This allows you to specify, for example, with the plus symbol. This indicates a specific user is allowed to encrypt messages. So, for example, frank.thomas@example.com, as it says down here, is allowed to encrypt. And you can specify which users can decrypt, which users can sign messages using PGP, which users can trade keys during SMTP sessions. And it does support either full email address if you want to configure this on a per email account basis, or using an asterisk, you can configure wildcards to apply these settings to entire domains. So then we can select the option to create keys for a specific user. This will create a pair of encryption keys. And then using the option on the right-hand side, using the drop-down menu, you can specify the user for whom you wish to create PGP encryption keys. And then you can optionally email the public key to the owner of that key so that they can import it into their encryption software to use for PGP encryption. There are different ways to encrypt using PGP. One of the complaints about PGP in the past is that it's been difficult to use, difficult to implement. We have features in MDaemon to try to make that as easy as possible. One of them is in MDaemon Webmail. When a user is composing a message, they can go to the encryption options menu to encrypt the message by, for example, selecting this option where it says require encryption. So we make it easy for the user to encrypt the message. When that happens, by the way, it's encrypted on the MDaemon mail server before delivery. You can also use the content filter to encrypt the message. So for example, you can specify on the left-hand side a specific condition, such as if the from header contains a particular address, or if the subject contains the word encrypt. You have a variety of conditions you can specify. And then on the right-hand side, you can specify what action to take. For example, encrypt the message using the user's public key, and then specify the public key that will be used to encrypt the message. You have resources to help you with PGP. Inside the MDaemon docs directory, there's an MDPGP quick start document that will explain how it works and explain how to configure it. And it's basically a crash course on how to use PGP for MDaemon. So it's a useful resource. You have your content filter, which you can access via the security menu under the content filter here, where you can configure rules based on conditions and actions. These rules can be quite complex. You can have multiple conditions in a single rule using and/or statements. So you have a lot of options for configuring content filtering rules. Content filtering rules are stored in a configuration file called cfrules.dat, as you can see here. This is a file that's located inside the MDaemon app directory. It's useful to be familiar with this file. You may not necessarily ever need to interact with it. However, if you need to create a complex content filtering rule, and let's say you might need some help from our support staff, they can write out a rule for you that contains regular expressions and various other complexities. And then they can say, okay, take this and copy it and paste it into your cfrules.dat file. So that's one reason it's useful to become familiar with the cfrules.dat file. There's a feature we have called attachment linking, which will strip attachments from email messages and store them on the server, replacing them with a link in the email to download the attachment. This can certainly help in terms of saving on bandwidth usage and help improve performance. And with attachment linking, you can configure these settings. Let me go back up one slide real quickly. So under set of attachment linking, this is where you go to enable the feature at a global level. And then you can specify whether or not MDaemon will automatically manage attachment linking, or if you want to configure attachment linking to store attachments in a specific designated path that you specify. Once it's configured or enabled globally, as you can see here, then you can go to each account via the account editor by clicking on the attachments menu, and you can specify this option here, use attachment linking, extract attachments from inbound or outbound messages. And again, it replaces them with a hyperlink in the email message. So now let's talk about mobile device connectivity. So this is going to be through MDaemon ActiveSync, which is also another separately licensed feature. So if you use ActiveSync, you can purchase ActiveSync licenses for however many number of users you wish to support via ActiveSync, and you can configure ActiveSync via the ActiveSync menu, as you can see here. When you click on Server, you can check this box to enable the ActiveSync server. This will allow ActiveSync mobile device synchronization of email, calendars, contacts, tasks, notes, as well as shared folders and public folders. You can configure ActiveSync policies. So MDaemon has 3 ActiveSync policies by default: unsecured, 4-digit PIN, and password required, but you can create your own. And I'll walk you through the process of creating a policy here. You've got different tabs for an ActiveSync policy. You've got your general tab where you can specify a policy description and name. You can specify password complexity settings here, whether a password is required, password length requirements, complexity level, password expiration settings. You can configure synchronization settings, such as whether or not to allow attachments, whether or not to allow HTML. You can specify a maximum attachment size and things like that. And advanced settings, whether or not Bluetooth is allowed, Wi-Fi, infrared, web browser enabled, remote desktop enabled, camera enabled, and things like that. And when you create those ActiveSync policies, those are stored inside. So if you notice where my mouse is here at the top, under the MDaemon data folder, there's a folder for each domain. And then there's a folder called AirSync. And then inside that is a folder called policies. All of your policies are stored here. Here is what that policy looks like on the right-hand side. This is useful if you need to back up your policies and then restore them for any reason. This is where you can go to do that. Now, when a device is synchronizing via ActiveSync, it uses collection IDs associated with specific folders. And these are the default collection IDs for your mailbox, your sent items, tasks, folders, calendars, contacts, and notes. So for example, you have this collection ID, this series of zeros here ending in 2. That's the inbox. Collection ID ending in 5, that's your sent items. Ending in 7, that's your tasks, right? So these don't change. What you'll see down here are the collection IDs for user-created folders, such as notes, tasks, calendars, and contacts, and so forth. So when you're looking at the ActiveSync logs, let's say you've got a user, you're troubleshooting an ActiveSync issue, you can look for these collection IDs and see if synchronization took place, see how many items were synced. In fact, on this slide, you can see here, again, the collection ID ends in 02, that's the inbox. This shows that one item was synchronized and one item was changed. There is also remote wipe. You can do a full wipe or an account-only data wipe on mobile devices. You can configure a variety of tuning and preferences and timeout settings for ActiveSync devices, such as ping intervals, timeout settings, folder monitoring intervals, maximum number of items per synchronization, maximum response size. This is something that you may never need to make any modifications to. However, if you raise or lower the maximum number of items per sync, and there are a lot of items to synchronize in an ActiveSync session, if you lower this number, MDaemon will initiate more sessions consecutively so that all items eventually get synchronized. Versus if you raise that number of maximum items per sync, one session might take longer, but it might synchronize all the items. You can experiment with these values for optimal performance, but chances are you may never need to really modify these numbers. You can configure or enable debug logging. If you needed to troubleshoot an ActiveSync connection issue, you can enable debug logging. If you needed to contact our support staff with help troubleshooting an ActiveSync issue, they may ask you to go here under Diagnostics, under ActiveSync Diagnostics, and enable debug logging accordingly. So now we'll talk about some troubleshooting scenarios you might run into. Keep in mind, when you're troubleshooting mail delivery issues, it's useful to become familiar with the various different MDaemon log files. Now notice, by the way, inside the MDaemon folder, there's a folder called logs. And the ones that you will use the most of all would be the MDaemon SMTP inlog. So this will be inbound mail activity. So that can be inbound from an external mail server, an external domain sending inbound to one of your users, or it can be an inbound connection from one of your local users, like let's say me using my Outlook client to send an outbound mail. That connection first has to go inbound into MDaemon before MDaemon can send it out. That will also show in the SMTP inlog. The SMTP outlog will show outbound SMTP activity delivering mail to external mail servers. There's the MDaemon routing log, which shows messages as they pass through the various mail queues. I recommend becoming familiar with the routing log because you can use it to follow a message down the delivery path by copying the message ID header. And I think I have a slide coming up that shows you how that works. You've got your anti-spam log for spam filtering activity, your MDaemon system log for system-wide activities like the system starting up and shutting down, system updates, and things like that. The screening log for SMTP and dynamic screening activities. And then if you're not sure which log to look to when you're troubleshooting any mail delivery issue or any kind of other issue, you can always start with the MDaemon all log file and find a compilation of everything in that single log file. MDaemon has colorized session logs to help you pinpoint various transactions taking place when troubleshooting mail delivery issues. So like if a permanent delivery failure is encountered, it'll show up here in red, for example. Again, I kind of alluded to this a couple of slides ago, understanding the MDaemon log. So what happens when a user sends an outbound email from Outlook? Well, like I said, it first has to come into MDaemon before MDaemon can send it out. So that's where it'll show up in the inbound SMTP log. That inbound connection comes in from the user's Outlook client to MDaemon. That message is first placed into a temporary queue for initial processing. That's also initial spam filter scanning and things like that. Then it gets placed in the MDaemon Remote queue, and then it gets sent out via the SMTP out log. By the way, as I mentioned, the mail queue. So in addition to the remote queue for inbound mail, there's also a queue called the local queue that holds mail addressed to your local users. So let's follow an outbound message. Let's say a user is sending an outbound message, right? So this is the SMTP end log. You can see where it says accepting SMTP connection from and then the IP address. So this is a test that I sent from a local Outlook client from this IP address. My MDaemon server sent out this, my mailexample.edu header here. My local mail client issued an EHLO command. And then my mail client, my mail server issued a hello, nice to meet you. And because it's EHLO instead of HLO, that stands for basically extended hello. It's the command that is used to ask the receiving server to send it all of the different protocols that it supports. So in this case, the server supports the ETRN command, the auth login, start TLS, the SMTP size command, and so forth. And then a mail from command is issued. That's the sender. The server says, okay, sender, okay. And then the recipient command is issued. And then the data command is issued. And then right here, the message is being passed through antivirus. So antivirus scanning takes place at this time. So again, the message was in a temporary queue. Now it's placed inside the inbound queue, as you can see here. And this is the file name ending in .msg. And then MDaemon sends out 250 OK message saved. So this time, MDaemon takes over message delivery of the message. And then the session is terminated. That's the inbound session, again, for a message that's going to be delivered outbound. So now MDaemon has to take that message and deliver it out to the recipient's mail server. So it issues an outbound SMTP connection. And you can track that connection using the SMTP out log. Right here, it looks a little bit different, but this shows you that the message is sitting in the remote queue. MDaemon at this time is resolving the MX record for the recipient's domain. And then MDaemon makes a connection to the IP address specified in the recipient's MX record. And the SMTP connection is established. And then from there, the EHLO command is given again. The receiving server gives us its supported extended SMTP commands that it supports. TLS negotiation is taking place, as shown here, which says ready to start TLS. And then down here, my mail server, MDaemon, issues a mail from command, and then a recipient to command to send that message to the recipient. And then the receiving server says, okay, enter mail and end with carriage returns, basically. The receiving server is ready to receive the message. At this time, MDaemon is sending the message. As you can see, it's still in the remote queue. And then you see transfer complete, and then you see 250 OK message saved. So the receiving server takes over. If you don't see 250 OK message saved for an outbound message, then the receiving server didn't properly take over, and you might want to check your network, firewalls, things like that to see if something interrupted the delivery process. I'm not going to go over this in too much detail, the SMTP flow. There's an example of this in the MDaemon manual, which you can access via the help menu in MDaemon. But when you're troubleshooting mail delivery issues, it's kind of helpful to understand the order of operations that a message goes through as it's being processed by SMTP. So POP for SMTP, for example, IP shielding takes place, relay checks, user quotas are checked, things like that. So again, I won't go over this in too much, but it is available in the MDaemon help file if you need to refer to this. Again, just part 3 of that, and then leading up to final delivery. In the MDaemon console, not available in remote administration, but in the console is this tool we have called Queue Statistics Manager, which you can access from the queues menu. That's really helpful for troubleshooting mail delivery issues. So if you want to, say, find a specific mail session, you can open up, like, for example, the SMTP out log, for example, right, in Notepad, and do a find command and try to find the email address of the sender or the message subject or something to find that message. It may be easier, however, to go in here to Queue Statistics Manager and open that log file here, because this tool will itemize all of the mail sessions in the log. Now, let me walk you through it. So we click on the log page tab and we click on Open Log button as shown here. And in this case, I'm going to specify the MDaemon all log file. You could specify the SMTP out log or the inbound SMTP log. I'm choosing the MDaemon all log file here. When you hit OK or open, this screen tells you the start and end date represented by that particular log file, as well as how many inbound and outbound SMTP sessions were found in that log. And then as you can see, it will list them all nicely for you. You can sort these columns by type, host name, from, to, subject, byte. And I think if you scroll further over, there's a date column as well. So you can really find what you're looking for. And you can simply double click on a mail session, and it'll give you the SMTP transcript for that particular session. You may find this a lot easier than opening up a login notepad and just trying to find it there. It's a lot easier. As I mentioned, you can track inbound messages using the message ID header. This will show you the path that the message took onto its final destination. So right now, let's say, for example, this message just arrived. It's currently sitting in the temporary queue. And I can see, for example, the sender, the recipient right here. That's me, and then my test server. And you can copy that message ID header and then do a find command in Notepad and hit F3 on your keyboard and hit the next button. And it'll keep taking you to each consecutive instance of that message ID header. This allows you to see where it's going from here. For example, this message is in the temporary queue. It's being processed through ClamAV. Then the message has been created. It's now sitting in the inbound queue. As it's in the inbound queue, the message is now going to the local queue. The message is now going through spam filter processing. The message is now going through antivirus processing, content filter processing. And then again, still in the local queue, the message is now placed in my local user's mailbox. It says MDaemon users, and it's got the domain, it's got the user's mailbox, and they've got the file name. This shows me that the message was delivered locally to my local user and placed in the mailbox. Again, for outbound mail, I know I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but if you do not see 250 OK message saved from the receiving server, but you don't see anything else that can give you any clues to why the message wasn't delivered, everything else looks fine, but you don't see 250 OK message saved, chances are that there's something on your network that's interfering with the delivery process. So check your third-party antivirus software. If you have third-party antivirus software running on the MDaemon server, I would recommend you configure it to not scan the MDaemon directory, because third-party antivirus software can sometimes cause problems with MDaemon. Also check any firewall applications, routers, and things like that. What about a situation you might have where mail is sent to an unknown local user or an invalid address? You might see something like this. It says, sender attempted to deliver message to unknown address. Okay, 550, recipient unknown. That's based on the, under relay control. So under security settings, relay control, we have this box checked. The SMTP recipient address must exist if it uses a local domain. That's why that message was rejected. The flip side to that is mail sent from an unknown local user. In other words, spoofing, right? So you might see something like this, 550 sender unknown. And again, under the relay control screen, you'll have this box checked. SMTP mail address must exist if it uses a local domain. So that's going to be the sender. That is why having this box checked is why my mail server sent out that 550 error message that you just saw in the previous slide. What about in a situation where you have mail that is sent from an IP address that doesn't have a valid PTR record? So a PTR record allows your mail server to do reverse lookups on incoming connections to verify that they are not trying to spoof the sender. And as you can see where it says, where it's highlighted in red, it's performing a PTR lookup on the inbound connection, and the PTR record lookup failed, and then my mail server issued a 501 connecting IP must have a valid PTR record, and then it terminated the session. That feature is based on the security menu under security settings, reverse lookups, having this box checked, send 501 and close connection if no PTR record match, right? So that's where that's located. What about if we have a sender who's blocklisted on a block list like spamhouse.org? I don't know if SpamCop is still around. There's all these different DNS block lists. As you can see in red, it says it's performing a DNS block list lookup on the connecting IP address. It was found on zen.spamhouse.org. And my mail server issued a 550 command saying that the connection is refused and the session is terminated. That's based on, under the spam filter, under the DNS block list configuration screen under hosts, I have right here bl.spamhouse.org listed here as a DNS block list that I was querying for inbound connections. What about a message that's blocked by the spam filter? Well, you might see something like this, spam filter processing. Right, so this message is sitting in the local queue, as you can see here, spam filter processing, and then you can see where it says start spam assassin results. This particular case, the message scored a 9.5. 4 points are required for the message to be considered as spam. And then below that, you have a breakdown of all of the different spam-like elements that counted against the message's spam score. Altogether, these totaled up to be 9.5, which is higher than the 4-point threshold to consider a message to be spam. That's based on, under the spam filter, under filter settings heuristic engine, having a value of 4 configured here where it says the message is spam if it scores greater than or equal to. That's where that setting is located. If you're using the MDaemon cluster service, so MDaemon can be clustered into a multi-server cluster environment for failover redundancy, a little more advanced, but if you needed to rebuild the cluster service for any reason, but you would stop MDaemon, navigate to the MDaemon app folder and rename the cluster service.dll file, and then download the installer from mdaemon.com, the MDaemon installer, and then rerun the MDaemon installation as administrator. When you rename a file inside the MDaemon folder and then reinstall MDaemon, it replaces that file with a fresh copy. In this case, basically rebuilding the cluster service. Oops, I messed up my pop-ups here. So you might get WinSock errors in MDaemon. Now, WinSock errors are typically network communication errors. They're not necessarily caused by MDaemon, but they're written to the MDaemon log files when they're reported by Windows. So if you have a WinSock error, you can check your antivirus software for one thing, configure it to skip scanning of the MDaemon directory, see if antivirus software is filtering any network traffic, check any of your security devices, like if you have a Sonic Wall or a WatchGuard or some Barracuda or any other firewall or some type of device on your network, check to make sure that they are not causing any interference with your MDaemon server. And then if that fails, you can also install packet sniffing software such as Wireshark to troubleshoot WinSock errors. And we do have a couple of knowledge base articles that talk about this in a little bit more detail on our website. You might have a situation where ActiveSync clients are missing public and shared calendars. If you run into that, you can first verify whether public and shared calendars are visible in MDaemon Webmail. So have the user log into Webmail to see that if those calendars are there. Try removing and re-adding the ActiveSync account to the device. Try removing the option to synchronize public and shared folders from the ActiveSync client settings, and then refresh the calendar, the contacts, apps on the device, and then re-enable the public and shared synchronization, and then refresh again and see if that helps. Inside the MDaemon APP directory, there's an ACL sh lookup.dat file, an access control list lookup file, and search for the email address that the folders are shared and see if it's listed there. You can try removing the ActiveSync client from the account editor in MDaemon. So you log into MDaemon and you remove the device. The client profile will then be recreated the next time the device connects to MDaemon, and you can verify then if the issue still persists. What about if you have a lot of inbound spam that's getting through? Well, you can review the MDaemon anti-spam log file, verify the Bayes scores of Bayesian learning. Again, that's an artificial intelligence to train the spam filter to become more accurate over time. If the Bayes score is a negative number, then the Bayes database may be corrupt, at which point you can rebuild the Bayes database. We have a knowledge base article on that. You could review your SMTP in log file to ensure that those messages are not being sent from a local IP address. If you have any local IP addresses on the allow list, under your spam filter, you have a setting for your allow list by recipient. Make sure you do not have any local addresses on the allow list. And you can try updating your spam assassin definitions or rebuild the spam assassin folder, which we recommend as a last resort. If you need to do that, you can shut down MDaemon, make a backup copy of the MDaemon directory in case you need to do a restore, rename the MDaemon spam assassin folder, and then simply reinstall MDaemon, and it will rebuild spam assassin for you. What about if a local account is sending out spam? Well, you can try locating the spam message in the SMTP outlog, as we can see here. Copy that message ID header, and then locate the spam message in the SMTP inlog to find the session where it was accepted by MDaemon. Notice right here, for example, we found the sending IP address, and we found the host name that was used by the sender. We see here that the sender successfully authenticated with credentials of the local user. Now, this being the case, and that happens to be a spam message, then we need to change the user's password, because clearly somebody is sending out spam because they guessed the user's password. If the sender is not authenticating, then MDaemon is not properly configured to prevent spoofing. So keep those in mind. What about if you have public contacts in MDaemon Webmail that don't match the accounts on the server? You can try rebuilding your public address book. So you can navigate to the server settings, public and shared folders menu. Uncheck, there's the option that says keep contact folders up to date with MDaemon account data, and then click apply. You can then re-enable the above option and then click apply, and then click yes on the warning indicating that the address books will be created for all domains, and then verify that the address books match the accounts properly. If you have messages piling up in the local queue, a couple of things you can try. Check your Windows event viewer. Check for situations where it says spam filter did not respond within expected time limits. Add your MDaemon directory to your antivirus scanning exceptions. So again, like I mentioned earlier, we just recommend that anyways. Just don't let your third-party antivirus software scan the MDaemon directory. It can cause problems. Check the MDaemon system log for any antivirus or spam filter errors. Check your MDaemon local queue for any lock files, LCK. So when MDaemon is performing a certain action, like it's working with a particular file that's in a particular mail queue, you may not notice it, but periodically and temporarily, it will place a file ending in .lck in that message, in that mail queue. But then it'll remove that LCK file, and that removal of the file allows MDaemon to continue processing the mail queue normally. If those lock files are not getting removed like they should, they're just remaining, then again, that's indicative typically of antivirus software or some other software that's not allowing those files to get removed. So watch for those. And you can also stop MDaemon and verify whether there's a process called clamd.exe and verify whether that is still running. And try rebuilding the local queue, which you can do by stopping MDaemon and renaming the local queue folder, and then restart MDaemon. You can then copy the messages from the old local queue to the new one, and then see if they get processed. What about if you can't access remote administration from outside of the network? Well, in this case, you can verify which ports remote administration is using. So for example, the default non-SSL port is 1000 or 444 for encrypted HTTPS connections. Try using the host name as well as the IP address to rule out like DNS issues, for example. Try connecting from within the network to rule out any firewall or network issues. And if you can't connect from outside, but you are able to connect from inside the network, then check your firewall, check your network security devices, and so forth. And then you can try running a netstat command from a command prompt to see what ports MDaemon is listening on. You might have a situation, for example, where MDaemon is sending out sender unknown when used with Security Gateway. So this is for those MDaemon customers who are using MDaemon along with our secure email gateway product, Security Gateway. Well, Security Gateway might be receiving 550 sender unknown when receiving mail from outside addressed to local users. If that's the case, in MDaemon, you can go to your server settings menu and relay control. And then where it says SMTP mail address must exist if it uses a local domain, you can check the box that says except for authenticated sessions. If you run into a situation where you have DNS server timeouts, you can try using Google's DNS server. So MDaemon does have DNS settings under the setup server settings menu where you can use the DNS servers that are defined in Windows, or you can specify your own DNS servers. That's where you can go to put in the Google DNS server to see if that works. You can try to verify connectivity between MDaemon and the DNS servers that you're using. And then finally, if you have questions, as an administrator, you want to allow your webmail users, so users logging into webmail, you want them to be able to contact you if they need help logging in. You can go to the Setup Webmail Settings menu under Settings and put in information where it says Sign In Failure Help Text. For example, I've got, for assistance, please call, and then a phone number and an email address to help your users if your users need help.